Outsourcing War, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In his military-industrial complex speech of 1961, Dwight Eisenhower warned of the growing influence wielded by corporations supplying the U.S. government with the materials of war. In today's conflict zones, private firms also provide critical services on the ground, from catering and logistical support to armed security. Recent high-profile incidents involving private contractors in Iraq have focused attention on the practice of outsourcing functions once performed exclusively by the military. Supporters and critics alike acknowledge that these contractors have become an essential part of today's military and are unlikely to be eliminated anytime soon. For a perspective on how private contractors found their way onto the battlefield and the impact they've had on the American military, we're joined today by Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist and correspondent for the U.S. radio and TV program Democracy Now! He's also a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine and has reported extensively from Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, and Nigeria. His first book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, came out last year. Jeremy, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, I'd like to begin with sort of definitions and, as is so often the case, sort of the legal ramifications of some of these terms. First of all, in the title of your book, you use the term mercenary. Is there a agreed-upon notion of what a mercenary is?
Well, the short answer to that is no. If you ask the leading spokesperson for the Mercenary Trade Association, the private security trade association in Washington, which is called the International Peace Operations Association, the head of that, Doug Brooks, in debates with me, has said that mercenary is defined as a foreigner or someone that we don't like. Now, of course, that's I would say that that's a highly inaccurate definition of what a mercenary is. I think when most people in common language think of a mercenary, they think of someone who is fighting with weapons in a conflict where their primary motive for being there is monetary gain. The United Nations adds a number of components to that, and basically it boils down to this, that it's a professional soldier who is hired by a country or an entity other than that of their home origin, and then sent to fight in a conflict to which their home nation is not a party. I actually think that it's reached a point right now where the term that we use is almost sort of irrelevant. It's more the issue of using private forces in war that should be focused on, not so much the words of it. I definitely think that Blackwater has been engaged in almost anyone's definition of mercenary in mercenary activities, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, there's been a long history of the use of those kinds of private forces, particularly on the continent of Africa over the years. We've seen a great deal of sort of third parties involved in conflicts. And what has their relationship to the parties of the conflict been, and how does it differ from the situation we're seeing now?
I think one of the worst problems with mercenaries in Africa has grown out of the apartheid forces of the South African regime, particularly after Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa. You had a number of members of the white apartheid security forces who then sort of put their services on the open market, and you saw companies like Executive Outcomes, for instance, rise up and become very active on the African continent, particularly in the 1990s. Sandline was another company that was founded by a former British Special Services officer, and they essentially put their services on the open market and were hired by parties to conflicts, for instance, in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. 1990s. And in fact, the mercenary industry sort of holds up the role that some of these companies played in Africa as being a positive one. They say that they were brought in to stop ethnic cleansing or violence or to intervene in a civil war and back the parties down. And that is sort of the way that they spin their history. The reality is that a lot of the forces that were working with Executive Outcomes and other companies that sprouted out of the apartheid regimes was that they utilized their same networks of contacts and covert operatives and weapons in some cases that were remnants of the apartheid regime, and then privatized them and put them on the open market. And Africa has suffered for many, many centuries, actually, under the use of mercenaries, not just in the 1990s, not just in the context of South Africa. Now we're seeing a legitimization of those services led by the United States and Britain, and actually incorporating these mercenary forces into the war machines of those respective countries.
And that would be a difference, would it not? I mean, in that era, these really were sort of independent operators that didn't have the sort of fig leaf of a direct contractual relationship.
Well, right now you have there's a story that's been unfolding and hasn't gotten that much attention, and it involves the son of the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. A British mercenary by the name of Simon Mann recently was locked up in a gulag, basically in Equatorial Guinea, after being accused of attempting to bring a band of mercenaries in to overthrow the dictator there. He was arrested in Zimbabwe, and eventually the Zimbabwean government handed him over to Equatorial Guinea, and it shows that even that same old network of those sort of apartheid era mercenaries are still active. But what you're getting at, I think, is something that's very important for people to understand, and that is now that these kinds of forces have been integrated into the U.S. military machine, and this is something quite new, certainly for the United States. The tradition of mercenaries in our country has primarily been to stand against them, where you had the Hessians and other mercenaries who came in and tried to effectively stop the United States from fully realizing its independence. And that has been the tradition of mercenaries in the U.S., is that this is a country that stood against mercenaries.
So what were the factors that really brought about that sea change?
Right. I think there are two things. I mean, part of it has to do with the dynamics of the Cold War, which at the end of the Cold War, which we could talk about. But when you look at it exclusively from a sort of military perspective in the United States, I would say that you would have to go back to Eisenhower, which you mentioned at the outset here. Eisenhower talked about the dangers of a rise of a military-industrial complex, where you had corporations that actually were profiting from a spreading of war or violent conflict. And what the traditional war market was in the United States was companies like Lockheed Martin or Boeing, who were making weapons systems or aircraft that were being used by the military. In the 1991 Gulf War, George H.W. Bush was the president, Dick Cheney was the vice president. There was a ratio of contractors to soldiers that was about one contractor to every 60 soldiers that were on the battlefield. And what those contractors were doing was primarily cooking food, doing laundry, driving trucks. Dick Cheney in 1993, as his administration was on the way out the door, when he was the defense secretary, commissioned a study from Halliburton, the company he would then go on to head in the 1990s. And basically what he said to Halliburton is figure out a way to privatize as much of the military bureaucracy as possible, with the exception of the actual fighting of the war. And so that gave rise to this incredible market in the 90s for Halliburton. Bill Clinton enthusiastically embraced it, pushed it along, gave Halliburton major contracts in the wars in the Balkans, certainly for operations in the Middle East. And then you have this sort of post 9/11 period where Rumsfeld is in office, Cheney is back again in office, and they decide to take it to the next level. And so among the first forces sent into Afghanistan after 9/11 were in fact private operators working for the company that I wrote my book about, Blackwater USA. And that was really when the U.S. began to dramatically escalate the use of so-called armed contractors on the battlefield.
And so what were some of the earlier examples then? You said it didn't begin with Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, where did the U.S. sort of put its toe in those waters?
Yeah. Well, in the 1990s, you had the president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was overthrown. And the United States State Department began a program to attempt to do two things: assist foreign officials close to the United States with protecting them, or to assist U.S. diplomats who were in hostile zones. And so essentially, the State Department created a privatized bodyguard service that would operate under the auspices of the United States government and under the auspices of the Diplomatic Security Bureau of the U.S. government. It was called the Worldwide Personal Protective Service. Most Americans have never heard of this, but this is the entity that Blackwater works for in Iraq right now. DynCorp, another major U.S. Private security company, Triple Canopy, those are the big three in Iraq right now. This program started in the mid-1990s, and it was originally envisioned as a sort of small-scale bodyguarding operation where you would send in basically a team of bodyguards to be around President Aristide at all times, keep him alive. And in the contracts, it not only said to protect him, but to protect him from embarrassment. And that remains the contract language. You fast forward now to the present day, and we've seen a dramatic escalation in the funding of that program and a paramilitarization of it. So in Iraq right now, it's not just a few teams of bodyguards, it's a paramilitary force several thousand strong, the most prominent of the companies performing those services being Blackwater USA. They're making a tremendous amount of money. They are taking former Navy SEALs and Delta Force guys, repackaging them as elite bodyguards. The U.S. ambassador in Iraq is not guarded by the U.S. military for the most part. Ryan Crocker is, in fact, guarded by Blackwater. And that's a very new reality for the U.S. war machine. And the final point I'll make on this is that Blackwater right now has, in Iraq alone, 2/3 as many operatives doing security as the U.S. State Department has full diplomatic security agents everywhere in the world. So in Iraq, Blackwater's force is 2/3 the size of the entire State Department's official security force.
Well, we've got just a few minutes before our break, but I wonder if you could just sort of sketch out the scale of the operations of the private forces in Iraq.
Right. And I know that you follow this closely, so what I'm going to say to you is probably common knowledge, but for a lot of people, when you hear the term contractor, most Americans, I think of people who are building bridges or water supply systems, etc. We use contractors in a very generic way, and maybe it's helpful to break this down. In Iraq right now, the U.S. has between 150 and 160,000 U.S. soldiers. What's not known by many people is that there are between 140 to 180,000 private contractors. Now, tens of thousands of these contractors are not engaged in armed activities. They drive trucks, they serve food, they do laundry for the troops. Jobs that were traditionally done by soldiers are now being done by people working for private companies. Tens of thousands of them also are engaged in armed activities like Blackwater. There are 630 companies working for the U.S. government in Iraq right now with about 180,000 personnel, drawing people from 100 countries around the world. That's the internationalization of the conflict. You don't have nation-state allies anymore. You have a coalition of billing corporations that you use to essentially bolster your occupation. Simply put, without these companies, this coalition of the billing, the occupation of Iraq would be absolutely untenable, impossible to sustain.
And is there a ballpark figure for just what the tab is running?
Well, Blackwater alone charges U.S. taxpayers $1,200 per man per day for its guys in Iraq, and that's just armed security. There's an estimate that I got from Henry Waxman's office that about 40 cents of every tax dollar being spent on the war is going straight to war contractors at a rate of $2 to $3 billion a week. We're talking about a pretty substantial amount of money. I mean, the economist Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote a book talking about a $3 trillion war, has already adjusted that figure to say it's going to be closer to $5 trillion. This is an enormously profitable industry, and that's what's scariest about it. It's a linking of corporate profits with an escalation of violent conflict, everything Eisenhower warned against.
Well, you reference Henry Waxman. Yeah. When we get back from our break, we'll talk a little bit about some of the congressional response. Sure. To our viewers, we'll be back in just a moment with International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Jeremy Scahill about the privatization of war. Well, this is by no means exclusively a U.S. phenomenon. I'd like to share with you something from a House of Commons green paper from '02, in which they were addressing some of these same issues of what the downside of all of this is. And really they identified three major issues, and I'd appreciate your comments on each. First of all, that the contractor's activities could cut across national foreign policy objectives. So in other words, there may be some disconnect there. Secondly, the activity of these private individuals reflects on the national reputation. And thirdly, the activities put nationals at risk, and does that obligate the state to intervene in a case where their citizens are in harm's way?
Well, that could have been written by many people within the U.S. military today. In fact, it very closely reflects what, interestingly, Defense Secretary Robert Gates said late last year. He said that the activities of many of the contractors in Iraq may be at cross purposes to the U.S. mission in Iraq. And what he was talking about was incidents like that which occurred on September 16, 2007, where Blackwater operatives killed 17 Iraqi civilians and wounded 20 others. The U.S. military goes in, investigates that, determines that all of the Iraqis, all of them, were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked shooting. And you heard military commanders saying, this is going to reflect badly on us. It could be an impact worse than Abu Ghraib, meaning that the contractors go in, they kill someone, they shoot up a village in the line of their protection of Ryan Crocker or some other U.S. official, and then the Iraqis see it, and they don't say, oh, well, that was actually private people from Blackwater, so let's go attack them. No, they say that was the occupation, and they go and carry a revenge attack out on the U.S. military. The other issue is that I talked to a lot of veterans of the Iraq War, soldiers who served there, and they say that the private security guys are kind of like the Rambos or the rock stars of the war zone, walking around, bossing their commanding officers around and telling them what to do. You know, and when you have a guy who was 15 years in the Navy SEALs and is used to doing that with a flag on his shoulder, all of a sudden now he's in a private capacity, it causes a lot of tension. The third thing I'll say is that you've got some private bodyguards in Iraq working for these companies making as much money as David Petraeus, the commanding general in Iraq. It creates a real morale problem. But I think the biggest problem for the U.S., if you look at it even from a mainstream pro-war perspective, is that the activities of these contractors on a regular basis has a blowback effect on the U.S. military and on the stated objectives of the counterinsurgency program.
Well, one of the issues that always comes up is just accountability. And in response to questions about that September shooting, Blackwater's founder, Eric Prince, said something to the effect of operational control of these forces is in the hands of the client, or in this case, the State Department.
Well, I mean, I think that in part he's probably telling the truth. I mean, Dennis Kucinich, congressman from Ohio, who's on Henry Waxman's oversight committee, described them as sort of an armed wing of the administration because, unlike many contractors in Iraq, Blackwater reports not to the military, but directly back to the State Department, i.e. the White House. And so Eric Prince, you know, in theory can say on paper the State Department is in control of his forces. We've seen numerous instances, though, where something happens with his men on the ground in Iraq and the first call that's made is back to him, and he tells them, hold things tight to your chest, which is what he did after 4 of his men were killed in Fallujah in 2004. No, I mean, this is an industry that is entirely unaccountable to the U.S. people and certainly to the U.S. Congress. None of them have ever been charged with any crimes for anything.
Well, and let's just look at the different layers of possible accountability and oversight. First of all, with respect to Iraqi law.
Yeah. Well, the Iraqi government, after that shooting, said we're going to prosecute them in Iraqi courts. They have to leave the country. They've committed an act of terrorism, and we're going to approach this as a terrorist crime. But the reality is that in 2004, Paul Bremer, the original head of the U.S. occupation, after a couple weeks of Jim Garner's time there, issued an edict on his way out of the country in 2004 called Order 17, which granted sweeping immunity to all contractors under Iraqi law. And he did that at a time that they were handing over sovereignty to the Iraqi government. It's a strange definition of sovereignty. That law remains on the books today in Iraq, so the Iraqis have no legal authority to try to prosecute these individuals.
And what about the military justice system?
Well, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, commonly referred to as the court-martial system, in theory could be applied to operators like Blackwater, particularly those that are veterans of the U.S. military, which many of them are. The real problem here is twofold. One is Blackwater is not working for the military, it's working for the State Department. There were adjustments in late 2006 to the Defense Authorization Bill by Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a conservative Republican but also a military guy, that sought to expand the reach of the UCMJ to fully cover contractors in a contingency operation. That hasn't been tested yet. Civil liberties advocates, I think, are going to stand up and say that they don't want to see these kinds of forces subjected to the court-martial system because it would be a creep toward applying military law. Secretary Gates, however, in March did release a position paper, a memo, in which he said that the military does reserve the right to court-martial all contractors who enter a U.S. war zone.
And then finally, what about U.S. law domestically?
This is perhaps the most complicated and in all likelihood the most realistic approach to it in some ways. There was a law that was passed in 2000 called the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, and it's a mouthful, but basically what it said was this. Any contractors working for or accompanying the Department of Defense abroad would be subjected to U.S. criminal prosecution at home for crimes they commit overseas, i.e., you work for the Pentagon as a contractor, you will go over to Iraq, you end up killing someone, you can be prosecuted back home in the United States. You will be arrested over there and brought home. The problem with that, as of September of 2007, when these Blackwater shootings happened, was that it only applied to personnel accompanying, and that was the phrasing, the armed forces of the United States. Again, Blackwater works for the State Department. So what happened after that was that the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed an adjustment to that act, which would have expanded the jurisdiction of MIJA, this law, to all contractors, including State Department contractors. It's held up in the Senate right now. President Bush has come out very publicly against it. He said it would invade on his right to set policy for the United States. So right now, as you and I speak, there is no law that we could effectively point to that says this is how you hold them accountable. It's a real crisis.
So there have been some attempts to address some of these issues following those shootings. Representative Waxman's committee did look at some of the things. Committee in October of 2007 basically was charged with looking at three questions. Has the State Department responded appropriately to the shootings? Number two, what were the costs to the U.S. taxpayers' reliance on other military contractors like Blackwater? And finally, is Blackwater's presence advancing or undermining U.S. efforts in Iraq? So what came of those hearings?
I've been to all of the hearings that Waxman has held on the issue of Blackwater. The reality is that what has emerged is that the State Department's response to crimes by Blackwater in Iraq has been to try to pay hush money to the families of Iraqi victims. An off-duty Blackwater operative shot and killed a bodyguard to the Iraqi vice president on Christmas Eve 2006. Blackwater snuck him out of the country. That man is walking around a free individual in the United States. In fact, he returned to the region and worked for another contractor. Blackwater ended up paying off his family, attempted to pay him off $20,000. Repeatedly, the State Department has tried to pay hush money. The State Department has circled the wagons, in the word of one U.S. official, around Blackwater to protect it and shield it from prosecution. They've given limited use immunity to the shooters at Nicer Square, which essentially will make it very difficult for the Justice Department to prosecute them. Is it at cross purposes, or is it hurting the U.S. efforts in Iraq? If I were a pro-war person, which I'm not, I would be very outraged at the conduct of Blackwater, because they're perhaps the single greatest impediment to the Hearts and Minds campaign of the U.S. military in Iraq right now. Is it a value to the taxpayers? That's something that I think needs to really be debated on a number of levels. Morally, absolutely not. Financially, you tell me $400,000 per Blackwater operative per year. Are the American people comfortable with paying that amount of money? I mean, the pay of an average soldier in Iraq falls somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 when you include the combat pay component of it. Doesn't seem like too good of a value, even if you're a supporter of the war effort. Well,
we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to touch on two upcoming sort of potential milestones. The funding for this enterprise comes up for renewal in May.
Right.
Now, how does that look?
Well, Blackwater is in a contract scheme in Iraq where, unless it's canceled in May, it will automatically renew under their WPPS program that we were talking about, their contract in Iraq. They may or may not continue on in Iraq, but they've already gotten what they needed from Iraq. They've won over $1 billion in contracts. They've secured a reputation as being the sort of bad kids on the block. We may think that there's a problem with their human rights record, but they're not in the business of patting heads and passing out lollipops. They're in the business of keeping Americans alive. They've been very effective at that, albeit at a great price to the Iraqi people and the U.S. military. Well, but Blackwater has bigger business right now. They're bidding on a $15 billion war on drugs contract. Maybe they're going to operate in Latin America. They're engaged in private intelligence services. They're making their own armored vehicles and surveillance blimps. They're a full spectrum operation.
Well, and then the other legislation that's on the horizon is the Stop Outsourcing Security Act by
Bernie Sanders and Jan Schakowsky. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Barack Obama's people have told me that he is not going to support that act, which seeks to ban Blackwater and force all private security companies out of Iraq.
To be replaced by
diplomatic security agents, fully burdened employees of the United States who are accountable under U.S. law. That gets into a very complicated area because the State Department doesn't have enough diplomatic security agents. So how that would play out on the ground is a whole other story. I think the only way that you could ensure that you don't have these forces in Iraq is if you support complete withdrawal. Neither Obama nor Clinton support that. Ironically, Hillary Clinton came out and became the single most important U.S. political figure to support a ban on Blackwater, but it's totally contradictory when you read her Iraq plan. If she becomes president, she'll need them to keep it going.
So yet another example then where the Iraq policy has unintended consequences.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there isn't actually a candidate running for office right now who has a plan to end the occupation. Obama and Clinton are going to shift it into a different mission. There will be a substantial number of U.S. troops and contractors in Iraq through whoever the next president is, their first term.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much for appearing.
My pleasure.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,